In this video, we'll take a look at a variety of shading styles that you can use when creating digital artwork. So here I have some line art that I made, and whether you're doing coloring and shading for line art or for stuff that's more painterly, these techniques can be applied to both. So I'll show you examples for both things here. For the line art, I went ahead and just made a background fill. And the way that I did that is I created a new layer below my line art, which is on this layer here. And I named it color. You can name it if you want to, you don't have to. And then I just went in with a nice bright color that I can see. It doesn't even have to be the color that I'm going to use for the person's face. And I just went in and colored it in with a brush called Scratchboard. It's in the pens category. It works really well to do nice opaque brush strokes with smooth edges. So you want to go through and fill this in, you know, like you would with a coloring book or something, and get it all the way to the edge, but don't go too far outside the edge. And because you're putting this color on a layer that's underneath the line art, you don't have to worry about the color going over the line art. It'll stay right behind it. So just do the edges because those are the ones you have to worry about. And then the middle you can just fill in with a really big brush because, you know, there's nothing to really mess up there in the center. So now that we have this fill here, we can use this along with preserve transparency to just easily paint in shading or more color however we want. So we don't have to worry about repainting this every time if we want it to change. So this would be the first stage of shading, is establishing your fill color. Now it doesn't matter what, when you're putting in this fill, it doesn't matter what color you choose. It just needs to be something that you can see. But eventually if you wanted to change it to a skin color, you could do that. And then you can have multiple layers of color. Maybe we also want the eyes to have some color. So I'll make a new layer for the eyes, turn off preserve transparency, select white, and use another scratchboard tool to fill in some eye color here. It's up to you how many of these layers you want to use. I generally try to break it up into anything that overlaps something else. I will put it on its own layer. In this case, it really looks like it's just the eyes. Maybe we'll do the irises also, just for the heck of it. And again, I'm just kind of just picking colors. I'm not really too concerned about choosing the right color yet. So maybe these eyes won't stay red like this, but I just kind of felt like picking red to fill them in. Zoom out a little bit, and there you go. Same goes for this sphere. You can turn on preserve transparency, and if you have something that's not line art, maybe it's a different kind of shape that you've drawn, you can go ahead and fill that in. And we'll look at some different kinds of shading. So first of all, there's flat shading, and in flat shading you might see this in comic books and cartoons and anime. They tend to do something that's like this, where you just use a limited color palette to do your shading. So this might be the most basic example of flat shading, and we'll do it on our head too. So I'm just gonna change the color slightly and go through and shade it. So you have to imagine, for one, where your light is coming from, and then two, you know, what kind of colors are going on in your environment. That'll help you figure out how to shade. You can watch my video on shading and rendering, and that will give you a better idea of how to choose those colors. But nevertheless, we've got an idea of where our light's coming from, and we just keep working with that. You can do shading really wherever you want, and this is helping to imply a 3D form. So we want it to look maybe here like the nose is, you know, there's a shadow underneath the nose because the light's coming from the top here and coming down, it's going to get blocked underneath the nose. Maybe we want the lips to look like they stick out more, so we put a shadow here. And you can really put these anywhere, and depending on how you use these shadows, you know, you can make this person's eyes look more sunken, or if we don't use these bags under the eyes, then they might look younger. Or if you wanted to give them, you know, wrinkles, you could do that. So there's, you know, quite a bit you can do here with this flat shading, and it's pretty effective. You know, you don't necessarily need to do any more than this. If you wanted to take it a step further, though, you could blend this, and then you don't have to have such hard edges. And you could have some hard edges and some soft edges, or, you know, any combination of both. And if you wanted to add more colors too, you could add a lighter color. And now add some highlights. So it's up to you how many of these levels you have, or how many colors you have. You can see it's pretty easy to build up a three-dimensional form. If you want to blend it, you can blend it. So it really kind of depends on what kind of style you're going for. I'm just going to show you lots of different ways to do this shading. So that's one way. Same goes for the sphere. If you wanted to blend that and then add a highlight. If you want to know how I'm picking these colors here, you can watch my video on color theory. That'll help you get a feel for how to pick these colors. So there you go, you've got a sphere. Some other ways we can do shading. I'm just going to fill this back in and fill this with our base color here. You could do airbrushing, which is most of the time how I shade, because I find it's just faster. And then airbrushing, you lay down color and you blend at the same time, and that saves a little bit of effort. So I use a pretty big airbrush with a low opacity, and I go through with my dark color and I just airbrush in some shading. This gives you softer results, which you may or may not want, depending on what you're working on. And we'll take a lighter color here. And airbrush in some lighter area. Whoops. And there you can see you can get some pretty good shading effects doing it this way too. I just kind of like the way the airbrushing looks for my work, so I tend to use it a lot. But you know, again, there's no right or wrong way to shade. There's just lots of different ways, and it's up to you to choose which one that you like to use. And you don't have to stick to one or the other. You know, you can, depending on the piece, you might want to use one shading technique and you might want to use a different one on another piece, and it's kind of the fun thing about it, is you can do that. We'll look at how to shade the sphere with airbrushing. So I'll pick a shadow color here, then I'll pick a highlight color. And there you go. You don't really have to blend. If you wanted to, you can go through and blend over it. That'll help it a little more. You could do that on the face too, anywhere that needs it. But for the most part, when you're airbrushing, it kind of saves you from having to blend so much. So we'll look at some other examples here. The next thing that we can look at is hatching. So hatching is probably something you're going to want to do more with line art. We'll go to our color layer here, and I'm going to make a new layer. So hatching generally is shading that's done with just lines, and they could be colored lines or just black lines, but that hatching implies shading in three-dimensional form. So I'll take just black in this scratchboard tool. I'm going to zoom in here, get in pretty close, and let's do some shading on the ear. So we want the ear to look like there's going to be a shadow, so I'm going to use a brush that's a thinner diameter than what I was using up here. And I'm going to do just these little fine lines that all go the same direction more or less. They can curve sometimes if you want them to, and they can also go against each other, but the direction of this line kind of implies the shadow. Maybe it's the direction that the shadow is getting cast and then it's fading, like so. Or maybe it's the contour of the part that you're shading, like for instance on the nose's contours would be something like this, perhaps. So if you were going to add shading to the nose, you would want to enhance those contours. Then you'd have to kind of plot out and see how you want to do this shading. I don't think that I like that nose that I did there. I probably wouldn't do shading like that on the nose anyways. I would do something more like this underneath the nose, because that's where the shadow would be. Underneath the eyes. So it kind of implies a darker color without really changing the color at all. You can see from a distance now it's starting to look shaded. If we do this with the sphere, we can get some shading on the sphere to make it look more three-dimensional. So these contours, again, I'm trying to make sure that I stay with them and don't work against them. And if you wanted to do cross-hatching, then you could do lines that intersect your lines. And you can see here now we got something that looks more spherical, even though it was just with flat color. But these lines imply shading and contour. Do some cross-hatching on our face if we wanted to. Something you'd have to kind of spend time doing. You don't really want to be too sloppy about it, and the direction of the lines really matters a lot. You can go one direction and totally ruin the piece, and go another direction and make everything look really good, so that's kind of how it works. There's different kinds of line shading that you could do. For instance, I'll just erase some of this here. Besides the hatching, you could just use different kinds of lines and squiggly things. They don't have to be, you know, solid lines or anything. You could use scribbles to do your shading, or you could use dots if you wanted to. It's called stippling. It takes forever to do, but that's the way to do it. And of course there's probably some brushes you could use that'll spit out dots faster than you can draw them like that. And you don't have to use only black. Your line shading could be one of your shadow colors, and you could use multiple colors if you wanted to do your shading. Let's look at some other types of shading that we can do here. Just erase this. You could use texture shading, so we could use something like, this is I guess kind of similar to airbrushing, but we'll use a texture here. Texture brush like the sponge, or we could use chalk to kind of imply some shading. That gives it a pretty nice character there. Do the same thing with the face. Add a highlight to it. And there you go, you've got some shading that makes it look more three-dimensional. besides texture, there's tinting, if you wanted to do tinting. Tinting is like airbrushing, except you don't have to really worry about screwing up your base color here. So let's say that maybe we want to just subtly shade this, but not too much to really like add any kind of clear definition, just something like that. We can do a little magic trick here where we select the right click on the layer, do select layer content, and then hide the selection with Control-Shift-H, and that puts the selection onto a new layer. And then we can pick any color we want and set the blend mode to multiply, and then we can tint this whole thing. So you can see I can tint it blue, and then if I wanted to knock back some of it, I can, using white to do that, because white on a multiply layer essentially erases. So this is another good way to add color and tinting to something without really having to worry too much about messing it up permanently. And I find the color almost kind of builds up more naturally too when you're using tinting, so I use it a lot. But you can see this tint is just on its own layer. That way, if we're not happy with that, we don't have to keep it. Or if you wanted to change it, you know, if you wanted to shift it, maybe using the effects or something to see what different kinds of shadows will look like, you could do that. You know, maybe I think this looks better, or, you know, maybe it looks better pink or something, who knows. And of course you could blend your tinting because it's on its own layer. And if you ever wanted to just fuse these layers together, and you could do that too, you could hold Shift, select both the layers, and then do Control E, merge them together, and then now this has become one single layer. And you could do some things like blend it more if you wanted to. There's a lot of different blenders that you can use to get texture, and paper textures that you can use. This coarse oily blender works really well along with the paper texture, and if you change your paper texture you'll get different blending results. So that's a way to kind of get some interesting shading effects. And then finally we can look at kind of subtractive shading here. So we could start with something really, really dark. I don't know if it's really subtractive, but it's kind of going in reverse rather than starting with the midtones and then adding shadows and highlights. We start with the shadows and build up the highlights from there. Some people like to kind of work in this order. I like to start in the middle and work my way around, but you know, everyone's got something that works for them. Now you're kind of working from the back to the front here. I'm using a bigger brush, just going over the whole thing. And you can see you get some pretty good shading results. Put in some more details with a smaller brush. And there you have it. So that's a bunch of different ways that you can use to shade, and have fun applying that to your work. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for my next video.